I wanted my father to understand I wasn't coming. My parents divorced when I was in first grade. Not only did my dad disappear like Houdini, he stole my mother's ATM card to her personal account and drained her dry. My mother, being the saint she is, didn't even bat an eye. She still was cordial to him and never said a negative word about him. To me, my dad, albeit abandoning us, was still my hero. From 1st through 5th grade, I had the usual abandoned by dad stories. Maybe 1 or 2 visits in a year and 50 times of me waiting by the front window with my suitcase packed to go to his house and him never showing up. My mom through all of this was supportive and never said an ill word about him. So he still stayed my hero. When I was in 6th grade, my mother finally remarried and my father, who only had a picture of me at 8 months old in his wallet, went ballistic. Did I mention he never paid child support? He would use his father's social, they had the same name, to get away with it. After my mom remarried, he let it be known that I was now my stepdad's responsibility. He cut off communication with me until I graduated high school. He didn't attend my graduation or send a card. What he did do was write me an email thanking God he no longer had to pay child support. He didn't anyway. What really broke me was his ruthless and brutal attack on my mother. Attacking her weight, looks, teeth, and blaming any perceived negative traits that I had on her. For the first time I realized what a coward POS he was. I responded in kind. He told me I was no child of his and that I was a waste. After that I vowed that I would hurt him. 10 years later, my father, not interested in my wedding or my son, reached out to me. You see, he is diabetic and one of his organs were failing and he didn't have long. He's too far down on the list and he needed someone in our family to donate. Nuclear revenge activated. I answered his email. I met up with him and pretended that I didn't hate his guts. I went and got tested to see if I was a match. I was. Did the therapy and met with doctors and his therapist. We scheduled the surgery. On the day of the surgery we meet at the hospital. I smiled in his face and let him know that I wouldn't be going through with the surgery. I watched the confusion line his face. I just wanted you to know that you're no father to me and you're a waste. I left the hospital and drove home. My mom was pretty annoyed with me that I took it that far. My father is dying and I will be attending the funeral out of spite. And I will let everyone know what a POS he was. TL.DR. Father abandoned me and called me a waste. Later in life he needs an organ. I agree and match with him, and abandon him at the hospital the day of the surgery after calling him a waste. He will die and I will ruin his funeral. Edit 1. This really blew up. For those questioning my actions I will give further detail. My father was / semi-obsessed with my mother. His attachment to us was only in his perceived ability to get back with my mother. In the beginning, he would call and make plans to see us. And just not show up. My mom would have to make up excuses. He has been married over 4 times and supports and loves his stepkids without any thought to us. Once my mother remarried he was done with us. He kept in contact with my mother through email but had no interest in talking to his children. I have reached out to him before. To invite him to my graduation, to let him know of my marriage, and that he was a grandfather. All I got back were pictures of his new wife's kiddos. Upon getting to know him after agreeing to donate, I went to one of his therapy sessions at his request. There I heard the story of the true reason he contacted me. I listened as he lamented about his impending death. How he was resigned to his fate only to have his new wife remind him of his former kids and maybe one of them will donate. And he got excited because he had forgotten all about us. And it was like hope renewed. Do you know how bad it is to listen to the person who is responsible for your very existence talk about forgetting your very existence? Like I was a pair of sturdy old boots that gathered dust in the back of the hall closet. Now rediscovered I was to be worn to go shovel crap. I knew that I wasn't going to give him anything. Edit 2. I'm not worried about a will or being left anything. He had nothing to leave. He's the male equivalent of a gold digger. He only marries women who can take care and support him as he mooches off of them. He stole thousands from my mother and she didn't press charges because she didn't want her children's father in jail. My mother was his first wife and he learned his lesson not to have kids of his own but to move into ready-made families. His ex-wives and their children have nothing nice to say about him. When I told him I wasn't going through with it, he understood exactly why. He nodded his head in understanding. I already was approached for money to contribute to the funeral and I will. Getting back at an abusive father. NSFW. This happened a little more than 10 years ago. Some backstory on my father. He had always had a temper, but with my mother in the picture she always keeps him balanced. He is a career Marine, so he knows how to give and take orders, but has zero tolerance for slack-jawed, squishy-faced retards that gape when spoken to and then F off to elsewhere. About 3 years before this incident, my mother and I are in a major accident. I survived, my mother didn't. After the loss of my mother and me becoming a rebellious stereotypically Irish teenaged girl, my father lost his stabilizing influence and started drinking. First the abuse was verbal. I could take that, yes it hurt my feelings, but I could go toe-to-toe with my old man when it came to insults. Then one day it happened. My father had gotten passed up for a promotion that was rightfully his, and I came home late, 5 minutes past curfew. He let me have it, called me every name in the book. I told him that he was a piss-poor officer that only keep control via threat and fear, which is the earmark of a pogass officer. Wrong button to hit. I had been spanked before, but he straight clocks me across the face. I don't remember if he hit me a few more times, or if I did fall over something and hurt myself. The next few moments are blurry from the punch and age. I tell my friend, and he tells me there are 2 ways to handle it. The proper way and his way. I asked him what his way was and he handed me sriracha and menthol crystals. He told me to get the lotion next to my father's bed and put a get squirt of the sriracha and a teaspoon of the menthol in the lotion and then shake it up really well. Sure enough, I found out what the lotion was for. I was woken up by my father screaming like someone lit him on fire, and I bet he felt like his nether regions was on fire. Between that and a very clear, very gruesome promise from my friend, my father never hit me again. You were never my dad. Back in the mid-90s my sister got knocked up by a guy. She was 18, he was 19. I despised the guy with pretty much every fiber of my being. My mom decided, however, that a baby should know their father, so she invited him to come live in our house without telling me. Took me a week to calm down enough so that when I eventually came back I didn't punch him when I walked in the door. John was a POS, great artistic talent, but all he did all day was sit out in the garage and do prison tats for people, in addition to stealing mine and my deceased father's power tools and pawning them for a few bucks so he could get some cigarettes. I worked a full-time job and went to school, so I would be gone 12 to 14 hours a day, but it felt like I was pulling into the driveway of a frat house, with a dozen or so people drinking and partying in the garage until I had to leave in the morning. I slowly curtailed all that by being a giant pain to all the guests by having their cars towed or their wheels inexplicably slashed. By the time my nephew was 2, I'd managed to put a stop to the 24-hour party zone, but people would still congregate on Saturdays. A few months later I'd had enough and threw John to the curb. My sister's friends all came forward to tell her about how he'd hit on all of them and probably slept with half of them, plus some other skanks he'd meet, all the while professing his devotion to my sister and their child. After I'd thrown him out, John disappeared for 8 years. No idea where, and I really didn't care. Then came a court summons for a custody hearing. John was suing for custody. However, in the 8 years since he'd disappeared, my sister had met a guy and they'd gotten married. My nephew was formally adopted by his stepdad and changed his legal name. The first hearing was dismissed because the allegations made as the basis for the custody hearing were investigated by CPS and decided as having no substance in fact. Nephew wasn't beaten, abused, or neglected. House wasn't a disaster and in danger of falling apart, nor was it a health threat. Every few months John would file another custody hearing request until it finally got a date. John made a number of allegations, all of which were disproven by documentation and fact. Finally, the judge decided he'd had enough and called my 10-year-old nephew up and asked him who he wanted to leave with. I don't know him. He walked out of my life when I was 2. He's not my dad, Stepdad is my dad, and he, John, will never be my dad. And I don't ever want to see him again." The judge ruled against John and dismissed his custody request with prejudice. When I looked at John, he was sobbing in his chair as his mother comforted him. I sneered at him and flipped him off as I walked out of the courtroom. As to why John was missing for 8 years? Apparently he'd been committed to a mental facility in Tennessee, and when he got out years later he went on SSI disability and then plotted various ways to hurt me, my sister, and my mom once he got out. He'd called CPS on us, made a number of anonymous complaints, and even called the fire department a time or two. The custody hearing was meant to be the culminating event. But fortunately John was an idiot and we had enough money to hire a good attorney. A few years later John tried to mend some fences with my nephew and invited him to come down to where he lived and meet his relatives, including a half-brother my nephew didn't even know he had. My nephew also has a half-sister, but her mother deliberately excluded John from the birth certificate. This is in addition to the half-brother and sister he has from his mom and adoptive father. Needless to say, my nephew was not terribly impressed by his relatives. Now my nephew and brother-in-law are some serious rednecks, and they both love hunting, camping out, and generally living the redneck lifestyle, but apparently John and his family took it to some serious extremes. There's a photo I saw one time on the internet with some guy sitting on a toilet on his front porch, and I imagine John and his extended family lived something like that, only seriously and not done as an internet joke. Considering the area, I would not be surprised. When my nephew was 15, almost 16, we received a call that John was dead. Someone had shot him as he sat on the couch in his mobile home. I felt sorry for John's girlfriend and her son, who found him, but for John, I didn't feel a thing. A journalist tracked my nephew down a few months later and filled us in on some details. Apparently John had been killed as the result of a murder-for-hire plot. We learned through our own sources that John had been dealing drugs and unknowingly moved into someone else's territory. The would-be drug kingpin paid a guy a few $100 and the promise of an ATV to kill John. Typical redneck retribution, I guess. The journalist asked my nephew for a quote. "Sure. I wish I could meet the man who shot him." "Why's that?" the journalist asked. "So I could shake his hand. John was never my dad, and I won't miss him." Oops, I forgot you are my parents. I don't know if this belongs here, but TLDR will be at the bottom. Excuse me for using a phone, being so long, and English being my second language. This is our cast. Me, AD, my a-hole of a dad, CB, careless B, aka my mom, S1, sibling 1, male, S2, sibling 2, female. This is the story of my revenge against my parents, but first a bit of background. AD was an abusive person, if you can call him that, and CB was a negligent excuse of a mom. For 17 years of my life, I had to take every, I deserve it, every, we don't have any money, and especially every, nobody is going to listen to a kid, because, everything I would say was a lie, or, it was just my point of view. Anyway, let's get to the story. AD had already have been abusing me for a long time, but I didn't care anymore. So I started small, calling CPS when AD and CB didn't have any food for us, S1, S2, and me. Then they would buy the food the day CPS would come, only to take it away or toss it the next day as a punishment. Then a little more adventurous, showing the wounds and scars to anyone interested, and that would make AD be madder and beat me up, especially with a braided leather belt that by the time I was 7, it was like a 9-tail whip, leaving open wounds all over my back, and then threatened to do it worse the next time, while CB would make excuses to cover AD. By the time CB and AD were going for the divorce, the fistfights would be even in public places but with no consequences, especially for AD because he had friends everywhere and a pristine reputation. The thing was that there were documented records of the hospital visits, records in the police station, that mysteriously disappeared by the court date, but they didn't know I kept tabs on everything by using my dad's tactics. After the divorce, sibling 1 stayed with AD and tried to repeat the cycle to no avail, while sibling 2 and I stayed with CB by default. Grandparents have no right for custody where I lived. CB had friends over all the time, even when she was married, at least the last year or so of it. So, sometimes I would headbutt with either CB or her friend until one day her friend said I wasn't helping in the house. One day CB stops us, sibling 2 and I, at 11:30 p.m. or so to talk and says that I have to leave her house. But suddenly sibling 2 pops out of behind the door and says, "Then who is going to take care of me?" So CB's response was, "Then, you go too." So, I was a minor at a time but getting college classes with another minor living at the streets for 3 weeks before I told my sister that, my friend will give her a room and I'll be fine. I was crying so hard I was shaking and angry, while I stayed at the streets because there was no room for more people. CB then accused me of kidnapping my own sister afterward. Revenge mode activated. AD and CB were still upstanding citizens in our community, so that was the first step. Step 1. I divulge all the information about the abuse to the whole community and the press, making AD's job look like hell because he worked in a college campus, then make every statement of the hospital staff, with their permission, known, as well as every excuse that my mom said in the hospital. Step 2. CB. CB's house had an issue where some parts would get slippery no matter the amount of water it was on the floor, so you see where this is going. She fell and broke her ankle to the point the doctor had to put bars and screws like there's no tomorrow to keep it together. And I made sure nobody would come to help her. The only one that stayed was the friend, but the strain was brutal in their relationship. She was in bed for months, almost a year, to recover, but not completely. Step 3. CB. Since CB was in a dire need of help, she begged, but I refused until she had learned her lesson. Then I went to her house and said, "You have been a careless bee all these years, tell me one reason other than you gave birth to us," as she stuttered, and I left her in her soiled diapers. Step 2. AD. Got all the girlfriends and let them know of how to get an order of protection, creating a history of domestic abuse and enough evidence to have a permanent one for us 3, S1, S2, and me. Then create a report of drunk driving by documenting all the crashes and bottles of beer and liquor in his house. Step 3. AD. Revoked his license, which in turn caused issues in his job, then let the job know the record I have of him, which in turn got him demoted and in probation. From then on he only was able to work with men to avoid any lawsuits. Step 4. AD. I spoke to the bank to let them know about the news and got AD to stop renovation of the house, which then destroyed his credit. From then on he really had no money for food with all his debt and even child support. I even got him arrested because he didn't want to pay child support to CB even though we were kicked out of the house. Step 5. AD. He got to a severe depression and took sleep meds but fell in the renovation area and couldn't shout to get help. I just saw him when S2 wanted to see S1 and just stared at him for a moment and then walked away, stating that my dad was at the bar so nobody would look for him. He spent the whole night in the back of the house, the half renovation, filled with cuts, gashes and a few bruises, I think. TL, DR. Sorry, excuses for mom and dad abused their kid to the point of not caring, and son don't help them when they were in grave need. P.S. I don't have a grudge anymore, and the abuse was without limitations. He tried everything on me and she didn't try to believe and see we were struggling.